Most people in survival mode don't know they're in it. They think they're just tired, or practical, or finally being realistic after years of wanting too much. Jung spent decades studying what happens when a human being learns, usually very young, that existing requires constant vigilance. What he found wasn't a phase that eventually passes. It was a personality that forms around the threat, and once it forms, it doesn't wait for permission to take over your entire life. Here's the paradox nobody talks about. Survival mode is supposed to be temporary. It's supposed to be the thing that carries you through the crisis and then releases once the crisis ends. But Jung kept sitting across from people, functional, capable, impressive people, who described the same experience in different words. They were alive, technically, breathing, working, maintaining relationships, getting through each day. And they hadn't felt present for a single moment of any of it in years, sometimes decades. What he recognized, slowly and then with disturbing certainty, was that survival mode hadn't carried these people through the crisis. It had replaced them during it, and it never gave them back. Think about what happens to an animal in winter. Everything non-essential shuts down. Heart rate drops. Movement slows to almost nothing. The body conserves every resource it has, spending only what's absolutely necessary to keep the organism alive until conditions improve. It works. The animal survives. But here's the part the biology textbooks gloss over. Sometimes spring arrives and the animal doesn't thaw. Sometimes it's been hibernating so long that the hibernation itself has become the entire way it knows how to exist. Jung would have called this the moment where a temporary adaptation calcifies into a permanent orientation. And he would have told you it's one of the most misunderstood states a person can live in, because from the outside it looks like coping, and from the inside it feels like the only option. Today I'm going to walk you through what survival mode actually is at the psychological level, and why Jung considered it far more than a stress response. I'm going to show you the specific things it quietly removes from your life, things you've probably stopped noticing or missing, and I'm going to tell you what escaping it actually requires, which is harder, stranger, and more worthwhile than anything the self-help world has prepared you for. Let's start with what most people get wrong. The common understanding of survival mode is that it's chronic stress. You've been under pressure too long, you're burned out, you're running on fumes, and eventually things will ease up and you'll feel like yourself again. It's treated like a weather pattern, something that rolls in, does its damage, and moves on. And this understanding isn't completely wrong, but it misses the thing that makes survival mode so difficult to escape. Jung would push back hard on the word temporary, because what he observed in his patients wasn't people who'd been under stress for an extended period. It was people who had reorganized their entire psychology around the assumption that stress was permanent. The stress wasn't happening to them anymore. It had become the architecture of how they processed everything. Their nervous system had learned, very early and very thoroughly, that the environment was unpredictable, that safety was conditional and could be revoked without warning. And so it started allocating resources accordingly, pouring everything into threat detection, vigilance, the ability to read a room before you fully entered it, and leaving almost nothing for the parts of life that require you to let your guard down. This isn't a malfunction. That's the part that makes it so hard to see. The psyche is extraordinarily intelligent at calibrating to its environment. When you grow up in a household where the emotional weather changes without warning, the smartest thing your nervous system can do is become an expert meteorologist. When you spend your formative years in a situation where the wrong word, the wrong expression, the wrong need expressed at the wrong moment could trigger something you weren't equipped to handle, learning to scan, suppress, and adapt before anyone asks you to is genuinely brilliant. The problem is that the calibration doesn't update automatically. The psyche often keeps calibrating to the original environment long after that environment has disappeared. She was 7 years old, and she'd learned to read the sound of the front door. Not just whether it opened, but how it opened, the speed of the handle, whether the keys hit the counter or got placed down carefully, whether the footsteps moved toward the kitchen or stopped in the hallway. By the time she was 7, she could tell you everything you needed to know about the next 4 hours of her evening from the sound of a door handle turning. She didn't know she was doing this. She thought everyone paid that kind of attention. She thought that was just what it meant to be alive. That's survival mode at its origin. A child's exquisitely sensitive attunement to threat, built to protect her, carried into every relationship and every room she walked into for the next 30 years. Jung recognized this as the beginning of something he'd later describe as a persona built entirely from vigilance, an identity constructed not around what the person wanted from life, but around what the environment demanded of them in order to stay safe. And because the construction happens so early, because it predates the development of a conscious self that could question it, most people have no memory of a time before it existed. They don't experience it as something that was added to them. They experience it as who they are. The persona, in Jung's framework, is the mask we construct to navigate the social world. Everyone has one. In ordinary development, the persona gets assembled from a mixture of genuine preferences and social adaptation. Some of it reflects who you actually are, and some of it reflects who you learned you needed to appear to be. But when the persona develops under survival conditions, the ratio collapses almost entirely toward adaptation. The organizing question behind every layer of the mask becomes singular and relentless. What version of me is least likely to get hurt? And the answers to that question produce a very specific kind of person. Someone who develops hypercompetence, who becomes so capable, so reliable, so indispensable that nobody in their environment has a reason to threaten them. If I handle everything, if I never drop a ball, if I become the person this family or this workplace or this relationship cannot function without, then I've made myself too valuable to discard. That logic runs underneath the surface like plumbing. You don't see it. You just notice that you're the person who handles everything, and you've been that person for so long that you can't imagine being anything else. Someone who develops emotional flatness, who learns to stop broadcasting feelings that could be used against them or that might make the people around them uncomfortable enough to withdraw. The face stays neutral. The voice stays even. The internal experience might be a 5-alarm fire, but what reaches the surface is a low hum of composure that everyone around them reads as strength. Someone who develops preemptive self-erasure, who makes themselves small, agreeable, undemanding before anyone has the chance to tell them that's what they need to be. You learn to want less, to need less visibly, to take up less space, to volunteer for the smaller portion, the less comfortable chair, the later appointment. And you don't experience this as sacrifice because you made the calculation so early and so automatically that it doesn't register as a decision. It registers as preference. You genuinely believe you don't mind. Someone who stays constantly productive, who fills every available moment with tasks, responsibilities, objectives, forward motion. Because as long as you're moving, as long as there's a next thing to accomplish, you never have to stop long enough to feel what's underneath the busyness. The productivity looks admirable from the outside. From the inside, it's a trapdoor covering something you learned a long time ago you couldn't afford to fall into. Here's what Jung would want you to understand about every single one of these patterns. They aren't character flaws. They aren't weaknesses dressed up as strengths. Every one of them was a survival strategy that worked. They protected someone who genuinely needed protecting during a time when that person didn't have access to any other kind of protection. The tragedy isn't that these strategies exist. The tragedy is that they don't have an off switch. They keep running long after the original threat has passed, long after the person has left the environment that required them, long after the vigilance has become more expensive than anything it's guarding against. And this is what makes survival mode so difficult to see from inside it. The persona is performing its function perfectly. You're fine, you're managing, you're getting through each day with the kind of efficiency that earns compliments. The system was designed for exactly this. It just wasn't designed to ever stop. What everyone around you calls you being strong or stable or low maintenance is often just your survival system doing what it was built to do, and the compliment lands very differently once you understand that. Everything the survival persona couldn't hold, desire, anger, joy, grief, ambition, playfulness, the whole messy spectrum of appetite for life, gets pushed into what Jung called the shadow. The shadow isn't a dark corner of the psyche where bad things hide. It's the place where everything that didn't fit the persona gets compressed, pushed underground where it won't threaten the system's operation. The rage that had nowhere to go, the longing that felt too dangerous to express, the playfulness that got trained out of you because the environment didn't have room for a child who was just being a child. None of it was destroyed. All of it was compressed, held at a depth where the survival persona could function on the surface without interference. People in long-term survival mode often describe a specific kind of numbness that doesn't quite match any word they know. It isn't depression exactly. They can function. They can even experience moments that look like enjoyment, but underneath everything, there's a flatness, like the emotional register has been turned down to the lowest possible setting that still technically qualifies as on. They hear music and know intellectually it's beautiful without feeling it resonate anywhere in their body. They receive affection and process it as information rather than experiencing it as warmth. Something in the system is filtering experience before it can land fully, and that filter has been running for so long that the filtered version of reality has become the only one they know. The animal in hibernation doesn't just shut down during winter. If it hibernates long enough, if the conditions hold it in that state past the point of biological expectation, something shifts in its relationship to consciousness itself. The den stops being a temporary shelter and starts being the entirety of the known world. The outside becomes theoretical. The memory of movement, warmth, the particular aliveness of being a body in open air, it fades. The animal doesn't grieve this fading, because grieving would require an awareness that something has been lost. And the whole point of hibernation is to reduce awareness to the minimum necessary for continuation. There's a threshold in this process, a line that Jung observed people crossing without recognizing they'd crossed it. It's the shift from "I am in survival mode" to "I am someone who lives this way." The language changes. The frame of reference changes. The person stops describing their experience as something imposed on them by difficult circumstances and starts describing it as personality. They'll tell you they're practical, realistic, self-sufficient. They don't need much. They've never been particularly emotional. They're the strong one in the family, the reliable one at work, the person who handles things without making a fuss. These descriptions feel earned because they represent real experiences of getting through real difficulty. And that's what makes them the hardest kind of false self to question. Because questioning them feels like dismissing your own history, like disrespecting everything you survived. Jung would recognize this as the moment the persona has fully fused to the face beneath it. The mask has been worn so long and so continuously that the wearer has genuinely forgotten there's a different face underneath. And the specific cost of this fusion is devastating in a way that doesn't announce itself. You stop being able to imagine wanting differently. The future you can picture is always a slightly better managed version of the present. Smoother logistics, fewer crises, more efficient systems. Never a fundamentally different way of being alive. The survival system has defined the parameters of what you're allowed to want, and you've internalized those parameters so completely that they feel like the natural limits of your own desire. You probably can't remember the last time you wanted something, truly wanted it, with the same uncomplicated hunger you felt when you were young, before wanting too much became associated with something dangerous. You've probably told yourself you're just more realistic now, more grounded, less dramatic about what you need. You've probably looked at people who want things openly, who reach for things without hedging, who allow themselves to be excited about possibility, and felt something you interpreted as maturity, a quiet assurance that you've moved past all that. Jung would say that feeling isn't maturity. It's the survival system's voice, and it's so convincing, so thoroughly woven into the way you talk to yourself, that you've started agreeing with it. You've started defending it. You've started building a philosophy out of a wound. The animal in hibernation isn't suffering. That's what makes it so hard to recognize as a problem worth solving. It's warm enough in the den, safe enough, getting through. And if you ask the animal, if the animal could articulate its experience, it would tell you it was fine, managing, adapted to conditions. It wouldn't describe itself as missing anything because the memory of what it's missing has been filed away so deep that its absence doesn't register as a feeling anymore. But it is, by any honest measure, not alive in the way it was built to be alive. It has traded its entire nature for the guarantee of another winter survived. If what I've been describing hits somewhere you weren't expecting, if the hibernation feels less like a metaphor and more like a diagnosis, we put together something specifically for this moment. It's called True Self-Discovery. 24 reflection exercises drawn directly from Jung's teachings, built for exactly this stretch of the road, where you're starting to see the survival system for what it is, but don't yet know what's supposed to come after it. Not a program that promises to fix you in a weekend. A set of honest tools for the honest looking that has to happen first. Click below to get True Self-Discovery, because here's what survival mode removes so gradually that you stop noticing the absence. And each of these losses is quiet enough that you could live your entire life without recognizing them as losses. You just call them the way things are. The first thing to go is the ability to want things for yourself. Survival mode suppresses desire because desire is exposure. Wanting something means acknowledging that you don't have it, which means acknowledging vulnerability, which means opening a door the survival system spent years learning to keep sealed. Over time, the suppression becomes so automatic that you don't experience it as suppression. You experience it as not wanting. The question, what do you want? When someone actually asks it, when a therapist poses it during a session, when a friend asks what you do with your life if circumstances were different, draws a blank that you fill with practical answers because the real answer is that you don't know. And you don't know because wanting has become psychologically associated with the precursor to loss. The system learned to abort desire before it fully forms, like a reflex that fires so fast the conscious mind never registers the impulse that triggered it. The second thing to go is trust in your own perception. Survival mode often develops in environments where the person's read on reality was routinely overridden. You were told you were too sensitive when you were accurately reading the room. You were told you were making something out of nothing when you were responding to something real. You were told the thing that happened didn't happen the way you remember it happening. Over time, the survival system absorbs this feedback and converts it into operating procedure. My perception cannot be trusted, so I will defer to other people's version of events. Jung saw this as one of the most corrosive effects of survival mode development, the learned distrust of your own inner experience. The person becomes dependent on external confirmation for things they should be able to feel directly. They check other people's faces to find out if what just happened was funny or offensive. They scan for reactions before they allow themselves to have one. Their inner compass doesn't stop working. They just stop believing it's calibrated correctly, and eventually they stop consulting it at all. The third thing survival mode takes is the ability to inhabit the present moment without scanning. Your nervous system stays locked in a posture of anticipatory vigilance, always partly elsewhere, always monitoring for what's coming next, always running a background calculation about what could go wrong and how you'd handle it if it did. The present moment is never fully safe because, to the survival system, safety is always conditional. It's fine right now, but the right now has a shelf life, and part of your attention needs to be allocated to predicting when that shelf life expires. Jung recognized this as the direct enemy of what he called genuine encounter, the capacity to be fully present to experience, to another person, to your own inner landscape, without the hum of threat assessment running underneath everything like a machine left on in another room. You can hear it if you listen. Most people in survival mode have stopped listening because the hum has been there so long it sounds like silence. These aren't things that were taken from you by force. You gave them up because giving them up was the smartest thing you could do at the time. And the part of you that made that trade probably saved your life, or at least saved something essential in you that would have been ground down without the protection. The question survival mode will never ask, the question it's structurally incapable of asking, because asking it would undermine the system's entire reason for existing, is whether the trade still makes sense now. Whether the winter you've been hibernating through ended years ago, and what it might cost you to stay curled in the den after the temperature outside has already changed. If you've ever been told to just relax, to slow down, to stop being so serious about everything, and felt a flash of something between frustration and shame, you already know, on some level, why that advice doesn't work. It assumes that survival mode is a setting you're choosing, that somewhere inside you there's a dial turned too far in one direction, and if you could just reach it and adjust, you'd start experiencing life the way people who say, "just relax," seem to experience it, effortlessly, naturally, as though being at ease were the default state, and you'd somehow wandered away from it. Jung would have found this advice worse than useless. He would have called it actively damaging, because it reinforces the one belief that keeps the survival system locked in place, the idea that the person is doing something wrong by being this way, that they're failing at a task everyone else seems to manage. It tells them their problem is a lack of effort in the right direction, when the actual problem has nothing to do with effort and everything to do with architecture. The survival system doesn't live in the part of your mind that makes conscious decisions. It lives deeper than that. It lives in the part that's already made the decision before you're aware there was a choice. By the time your conscious mind says, "I should enjoy this," your nervous system has already scanned the room, assessed the threat level, identified the exits, and calculated how quickly you could leave if you needed to. The thought arrives after the system has already done its work. You're not choosing hypervigilance any more than you're choosing your heartbeat. The machinery is running beneath the floor of awareness, and no amount of positive intention changes what happens in the basement. This is why willpower fails so spectacularly against survival mode. Willpower operates at the level of conscious choice. Survival mode operates at the level of identity, and identity will always overrule intention when the two collide. You can decide, genuinely and with full sincerity, to be more present, more open, more willing to enjoy things, and within 48 hours, sometimes within 48 minutes, the survival persona will reassert itself so smoothly that you won't even register the moment you went back to scanning, managing, bracing. It will feel like you just forgot, like the intention slipped your mind, What actually happened is that the system absorbed the intention and neutralized it, the same way it absorbs everything that threatens its operation. Jung understood that the persona doesn't yield to intention. It yields to encounter, the slow, deliberate, often uncomfortable process of bringing unconscious material into conscious awareness. You don't think your way out of survival mode, you feel your way out, and feeling is exactly what the survival system was built to prevent.
The problem isn't that you don't want to live differently.
You probably want it badly enough that the wanting itself has become another source of pain. Because you can see the gap between how you're living and how you sense you could be living, and you can't figure out how to cross it. The problem is that a part of you, a very intelligent, well-defended part, has concluded with absolute certainty that living differently is how you get destroyed. That part watched what happened when you were open and unguarded. It took notes, it built walls, and it is not interested in your conscious mind's latest theory about why those walls should come down. It needs something much more persuasive than an argument. It needs an experience. Jung wrote about something he called the night sea journey, a motif he found recurring in mythologies across every culture he studied. The story of a figure swallowed by some great creature and carried through darkness, through the belly of something vast and unknown, before being expelled on the other side, transformed. He studied this pattern obsessively because he believed the ancient storytellers had stumbled onto a psychological truth that modern science hadn't yet caught up to. The journey wasn't metaphorical. It described something real that happened in the psyche during periods of genuine transformation. What Jung observed in his patients, and in himself, during a period of inner confrontation so intense, he questioned whether he was losing his mind, was that healing from survival mode required going into the material, not around it. The night sea journey is the movement toward everything you've been managing away from. The grief you didn't grieve because there wasn't time, and anyway, no one asked. The rage you swallowed because expressing it felt like it would confirm something about you that the survival persona couldn't afford to have confirmed. The longing you sealed off because wanting things from people who couldn't give them was a particular kind of torture your system learned to avoid by eliminating the wanting altogether. All of that material is still in you, compressed, held at depth, generating pressure, and the survival system's position on it has never changed. Leave it alone. Don't go down there. You survived by not feeling this, and if you start feeling it now, it will overwhelm you. You will fall apart. You will become the thing you've spent your entire life proving you're not, someone who can't handle it. Jung found the opposite to be true. In patient after patient, across decades of observation, he watched people descend into material they were certain would destroy them, and come through to something the survival system never could have offered. Every person who went in expecting annihilation found instead that the material had weight, but not the infinite weight the system had projected onto it. The grief was real, but survivable. The anger was intense, but clarifying. The longing was painful, but also, underneath the pain, profoundly informative, because it pointed directly at what mattered to them, at what they'd been starving themselves of, at the precise contours of the life they actually wanted. Think about someone who spent 20 years being the person who handled everything. Every crisis at work, every family emergency, every relational demand. Absorbed without complaint, because complaint felt like the first crack in a wall that couldn't afford any cracks. They were so consistently reliable that people stopped checking on them. Not out of cruelty, but because the performance was that convincing. Why would you ask how someone's doing when they so clearly have it all under control? Then one evening, driving home from nothing in particular, they started crying. No trigger they could identify. No specific thought that broke through. Just tears, sudden and total, arriving from somewhere they'd forgotten existed. And for the first time in 20 years, they didn't try to stop it. They pulled over, sat in the car in the dark, and let it happen. Nobody was watching. Nobody needed them to hold it together. And in that absence of audience, something real surfaced. That moment, parked on the shoulder of the road with the engine still running and their hands shaking, Jung would have recognized immediately. He would have called it the beginning of the night sea journey. The survival system, for reasons it couldn't fully control, went temporarily offline. And through the gap, something true came up. Something that had been waiting, patiently and then less patiently, for exactly this kind of unguarded moment. There's a specific kind of suffering that survival mode produces once the original circumstances have genuinely changed. And it's one of the cruelest paradoxes Jung observed. The threat that built the system is gone. The childhood environment that required hypervigilance is decades in the past. The relationship that demanded emotional suppression ended years ago. The person has, by any external measure, reached safety, and the suffering intensifies. This seems backwards until you understand what safety does to a system calibrated entirely for threat. Danger gives the survival persona a job to do. It keeps every circuit occupied. There's always the next thing to scan for, prepare against, manage. The busyness of vigilance is its own kind of anesthetic. You don't have time to feel the cost of the system when the system is actively engaged. But when the threat recedes, when the environment genuinely softens, the survival system doesn't stand down. It does the only thing it knows how to do. It scans harder. It looks for the threat that must be hiding in the safety. It generates anxiety from calm because, in its operating logic, calm has never been trustworthy. Calm has always been the brief pause before something went wrong. You've probably felt this, the way a genuinely good stretch makes you quietly brace for its collapse. A relationship is going well, and instead of settling into it, part of you starts cataloging everything that could go wrong. Work is stable, finances are manageable, nothing is on fire, and you feel more unsettled than when 3 things were falling apart at once, because at least the falling apart gave you something concrete to respond to. The peace should feel like relief. Instead, it feels like standing in an open field with no cover, exposed to something you can't see yet but are certain is coming. That vigilance isn't protecting you from anything real anymore. It's running on its own fuel now, generating the very anxiety it claims to be guarding against. But it doesn't know that. And here's the depth of the trap. You can understand this intellectually, agree with it completely, and still feel the vigilance humming underneath every calm moment, like a motor that won't shut off. Because understanding happens in the conscious mind. The survival system operates below the conscious mind. They don't share a language. The conscious mind can explain to itself all day long that the threat is over. The survival system isn't listening to explanations. It's listening to the body, to the nervous system, to the 20-year-old record of what happened the last time things felt this quiet. And that record says, prepare. This is why people who've lived in survival mode for years often describe being more comfortable in chaos than in peace. Chaos is the known environment. They have scripts for chaos, strategies for it, an entire identity built around navigating it. Peace requires a completely different set of capacities, the ability to be still without scanning, to receive without bracing, to trust that the present moment is what it appears to be. Those capacities were never developed because the original environment never required them. They were never even attempted because attempting them felt, to the survival system, like removing your armor in the middle of a battlefield. And this brings us to something Jung spent a significant portion of his career trying to articulate. What happens to the life force itself when it gets compressed under survival mode for long enough? The shadow, in Jung's framework, holds everything the persona rejects. In most people, the shadow contains the qualities that don't fit the social mask. Some aggression, some selfishness, some desire that polite society doesn't condone. But in someone whose persona was built from survival rather than social convention, the shadow contains something far more fundamental. It contains vitality itself, the raw, messy, ungovernable appetite for being alive. Because vitality is exactly what the survival system had to suppress. Joy is unpredictable and makes you visible. Desire creates vulnerability. Ambition requires risk. Playfulness drops the guard. Even anger, which is often the life force in its most urgent form, had to be sealed away because expressing it in the original environment would have been catastrophic. So the survival persona did something extraordinary in its efficiency and devastating in its consequences. It pushed the person's fundamental aliveness into the shadow and left just enough animation on the surface to pass for a functioning human being. These qualities didn't die. Jung was insistent about this. The shadow doesn't destroy what it receives. It compresses it, holds it under pressure. And pressurized material doesn't sit quietly forever. People who've been in survival mode for decades often experience their compressed vitality erupting in ways that feel foreign and alarming. A sudden, intense desire to leave everything, the job, the city, the relationship, that arrives with a force completely disproportionate to any conscious thought process. Waves of ambition or creative hunger that surface and then get immediately smothered by the survival system's voice telling them it's impractical, selfish, too late. Rage that detonates in small moments, someone cutting them off in traffic, a minor inconvenience at work. Because the rage was never really about the trigger. It was 30 years of swallowed fury looking for any crack to escape through. Jung would say these eruptions aren't signs of instability. They're the shadow knocking on the door of a system that has been ignoring it since childhood. And what the shadow is holding, if the person can stay present to it long enough to actually look, is everything they've been missing. The capacity for joy they've been too guarded to access. The ambition they decided was arrogant or unrealistic. The desire for genuine connection they stopped allowing themselves to want. The anger at their own self-erasure that they've never fully let themselves feel, because feeling it would mean acknowledging how much they gave away and how long they gave it away for. This material doesn't feel safe when it surfaces. To the survival system, it feels like the most dangerous thing in the world, because desire of any kind in the original environment was the thing that preceded loss. You wanted something, you got hurt. You reached for something, it was taken or denied. You let yourself feel something fully, and it was used against you or met with indifference. The survival system made an airtight case based on real evidence that wanting was the problem. And now the shadow is asking you to want again. No wonder the system fights it. The animal that's been hibernating, when the season finally turns, when something in the light changes and the temperature shifts, something responds before the animal has made any decision about whether it's safe. The stirring isn't cognitive. It comes from somewhere older than thought, somewhere that remembers what it means to be fully awake even after months of dormancy. Muscles that haven't moved begin to twitch. The heart rate increases. The metabolism starts to climb back toward the level required for movement, for engagement, for the particular aliveness of a body in open air. The stirring is biological, involuntary, the organism asserting what it actually is underneath the adaptation that kept it alive. And the stirring is, in every way that matters, a sign that something is working correctly. The problem comes when the animal has been hibernating so long that it fights the thaw, when it burrows deeper into the den, when the familiar dark feels safer than the unknown light beginning to seep in through the entrance. Here's what survival mode will never volunteer, the thing it structurally cannot tell you, because telling you would undermine its entire reason for operating. Living. Genuinely living, in the way Jung meant when he talked about individuation, costs you the one thing the survival system was specifically engineered to protect: your invulnerability. Every self-help framework, every productivity system, every motivational approach promises you a better managed version of the same basic stance toward life. Try harder, think smarter, optimize the system, get more efficient at getting through. And none of them ask you to fundamentally change your relationship to exposure, to risk, to the possibility that wanting something might lead to not getting it. Jung proposed something categorically different. He proposed that you stop getting through and start being here. And being here means allowing yourself the full weight of experience, the joy that could be followed by loss, the connection that could be followed by abandonment, the desire that could be followed by disappointment. The survival system has seen all of those sequences play out. It knows exactly what each one costs, and it built itself, brick by brick, to make sure you never went through them again. So the real conversation, the one that happens beneath all the self-improvement language, beneath the goals and the therapy homework and the meditation practice, is simpler and more terrifying than any of those frameworks acknowledge. It's this: are you willing to want things again, knowing that wanting means the possibility of not getting them? Are you willing to feel things at full volume after years of keeping the dial turned down? Are you willing to need people, knowing that need creates the exact kind of exposure your entire system was designed to prevent? Jung considered this the crux of everything, the central question that every human being living in survival mode eventually faces, whether they frame it in these terms or not. And he was honest, more honest than most people in his position would have been, that many people, when they genuinely understand what the question is asking, hesitate. They want to want again, in theory. They want to feel alive, in concept. But when the actual door opens, when the actual opportunity to drop the armor presents itself, the survival system's voice is louder and more convincing than any aspiration, and the person steps back. The question this raises about you, and I'm asking it with the same care Jung brought to the people sitting across from him, is whether you've been telling yourself you want to escape survival mode while quietly staying very comfortable inside it. Because survival mode is painful in ways that are easy to name. The flatness, the exhaustion, the sense of going through motions. But it's also safe in ways that are hard to admit. You know exactly who you are inside the system. You know what to expect from yourself. You know the precise dimensions of your cage, and there's a kind of security in that. The security of a suffering you've mastered, a limitation you understand. A life that asks nothing of you that you haven't already proven you can give. Until you're honest about that safety, about what the survival system is actually offering you in exchange for everything it takes, the attempts to live differently will keep hitting the same wall. You'll try and retreat, and each retreat will feel like evidence that you're incapable of change, when what's actually happening is that you haven't yet reckoned with what change really costs. But here's what Jung found in the people who hesitated and then moved forward anyway. The ones who stood at the edge of that question felt the full weight of what it was asking and chose to step through even with the survival system screaming at them to stay in the den. What he saw in those people doesn't look like triumph. It doesn't look like the dramatic, cinematic breakthrough the culture teaches you to expect. It looks like something much quieter and much more real than that. It looks like someone learning to use their own hands after years of keeping them clenched. Slow, awkward, full of false starts. The people Jung watched cross that threshold didn't suddenly become radiant or free. They became, for the first time, available to their own experience. And that availability was so unfamiliar that it often felt worse before it felt like anything resembling better. This is the part that no one prepares you for. The beginning of genuine living, in Jung's observation, looked almost indistinguishable from the beginning of grief. Because the moment the survival system loosens its grip even slightly, the first thing that moves through the gap isn't joy or liberation. It's everything the system was holding back. Every swallowed feeling, every compressed year, every moment of aliveness that got intercepted before it could register, all of it starts surfacing at once, and the sheer volume of it can feel like confirmation that you've made a terrible mistake. Think about someone who's been holding their breath for so long that holding their breath stopped registering as effort. It just became the way breathing worked. They start doing the inner work. They slow down. They create a little room. And within weeks, they find themselves ambushed by emotion in the middle of completely ordinary moments. A song they've heard 100 times suddenly drops them. A friend says something kind, and instead of absorbing it the way they usually do, efficiently, without residue, it lands somewhere unprotected, and they have to leave the room. Light hits a window in the afternoon, and they feel something so large and unnamed that it scares them. They think the work broke something. What actually happened is the work opened something, and the feeling was always there, pressed flat against the floor of the system, waiting for enough silence to finally be heard. Jung saw patients pull back at exactly this point. They'd interpret the flood as evidence that going deeper was dangerous, that the numbness, for all its limitation, was at least stable. And he understood the logic. The survival system had spent years arguing that feeling was the enemy, and here was feeling, arriving in overwhelming quantities, apparently proving the system right. But Jung held a different position, one he maintained across decades of watching this pattern unfold. The surfacing is the healing. The feelings aren't new damage created by the process. They're old material being metabolized for the first time. And metabolizing them, which is slower and messier than anyone wants it to be, is what creates the internal space that actual living requires. The first real movement toward living, Jung observed, doesn't involve doing anything differently on the outside. It involves developing what he described as the capacity to watch your own patterns without being entirely consumed by them. Learning to notice the moment when a response belongs to the survival system rather than to you. This sounds abstract until you're in it, and then it becomes the most concrete thing in the world. You're in a conversation, and someone offers you something, a compliment, an invitation, a moment of genuine warmth, and you feel the system engage before you've consciously processed what's happening. The deflection is already forming. The dismissal is already taking shape. The part of you that learned long ago that receiving anything fully was too expensive is already doing its work. And for the first time, you catch it. You see it happening in real time. You notice the gap between what the system wants to do and what you might actually want, if you let yourself want anything at all. That noticing changes everything, though it changes everything slowly. The survival system speaks in absolutes. I can't. It's too late. That kind of life isn't for me. Wanting things like that is how you get wrecked. The voice underneath it, the one Jung spent his career trying to help people hear, tends to be quieter, less certain, more specific. It doesn't say, I want a better life. It says something particular. I want to paint again. I want to call that person and tell them what they mean to me. I want to stop pretending this job is enough. The survival system deals in categories and generalizations because categories are easier to dismiss. The authentic voice deals in specifics because specifics are harder to argue with. Learning to hear the difference between those two voices is the first movement. The second is harder, and it's where Jung saw people struggle most visibly. Once you can hear the authentic voice, Once you catch the specific, quiet desire surfacing before the system smothers it, the work becomes learning to let it exist without immediately doing something about it. The survival system taught you that desire operates on a binary. Either you grab for it desperately, or you kill it before it can hurt you. There's no middle ground in the survival system's vocabulary. Desire is an emergency, one way or the other. Living requires a completely different relationship. Desire isn't an emergency, it's information. It's telling you something about who you actually are beneath the adaptation, and it can be held, gently, without clutching, without extinguishing, the way you'd hold something fragile that you're still learning to trust yourself with. Jung saw this tolerance for desire as one of the most significant developmental steps a person could take, moving from treating wanting as a threat to treating wanting as intelligence about the self. It sounds simple, and it is genuinely, profoundly difficult, because the survival system will immediately generate 12 excellent reasons why any given desire is impractical, selfish, poorly timed, or guaranteed to end in disappointment. And those reasons won't feel like avoidance. They'll feel like the most reasonable thoughts you've ever had. The third movement builds on the first two, and it's the one that Jung kept circling back to as the actual substance of a life that's being lived rather than managed. It's the ongoing, never-finished practice of meeting the present moment without treating it as a problem to be solved. The survival system's relationship to right now has always been strategic. Scan the environment, identify what could go wrong, prepare a response, protect the perimeter. Every moment is a potential threat dressed as a neutral event. Living asks something entirely different. It asks you to encounter, to actually be in the room you're sitting in, with the person you're sitting with, feeling what you're feeling without the constant background calculation of what might happen next. Jung described this capacity for genuine encounter as the beating heart of individuation, the thing that makes a life feel like it belongs to the person living it, and he acknowledged, with the honesty that made him both admired and difficult, that this capacity can't be downloaded or decided into existence. It develops through repetition, through the unglamorous discipline of catching yourself scanning and choosing, just for a moment, to be here instead. Noticing the texture of a conversation rather than monitoring it for signs of danger. Registering the taste of food rather than eating while planning the next 3 hours. Letting a moment of beauty land on you without immediately armoring against the possibility that beauty is temporary and therefore not worth trusting. It sounds almost insultingly ordinary. That's exactly what makes it so hard for someone whose entire system is calibrated for extraordinary threat. The survival persona doesn't have a setting for just being here. Stillness feels like exposure. Presence feels like dropping your guard in hostile territory. And every time you practice it, the system will flood you with reasons to pick the vigilance back up, because vigilance has kept you alive. And what has presence ever done for you? Everything, actually. But you don't know that yet. You can't know it until you've accumulated enough moments of genuine encounter to feel the difference in your own body between a life managed and a life inhabited. And this is where the cost becomes real in ways that go beyond the internal. Jung would never have described this transition as easy or clean, and misrepresenting it would betray the honesty he brought to every person who sat across from him. Beginning to live, genuinely, from the authentic self rather than the survival persona, means renegotiating almost every relationship that was built on the old system. The people who knew you as the one who never needed anything, who always held it together, who absorbed every crisis without complaint. Some of them will find the version of you that starts expressing needs, setting limits, refusing to carry what doesn't belong to you genuinely disorienting. Your needs were invisible before. Your preferences were absent. Your anger was so deeply suppressed that people forgot you were capable of it, and maybe you forgot too. The version of you that starts requiring acknowledgement, that says no without manufacturing an excuse, that stops absorbing other people's emergencies as a way of avoiding your own interior. That version disrupts every dynamic calibrated to the survival persona's compliance. Some people will adjust, some won't. And the ones who won't will often frame your honesty as betrayal, your boundaries as abandonment, your authenticity as selfishness. Because the system that held them was built on your self-erasure, and your refusal to keep erasing yourself pulls the foundation out from under something they depended on without ever having to name it. Jung observed this consistently. Individuation costs belonging in the short term. The old belonging was real. It sustained you. It gave you a place in the world. It provided the only form of connection the survival persona knew how to maintain. But it was built on performance. The new belonging, when it eventually forms, is built on actual contact, on being known for who you are rather than valued for what you provide. The space between those two kinds of belonging is real, and it can be lonely in a way that makes the survival system's case for retreating back to the persona almost unbearably persuasive. There's also the identity cost, which is subtler but just as significant. The survival persona offered you something in exchange for everything it took: competence, mastery over difficulty, the identity of someone who can handle it, whatever it turns out to be. Beginning to want things means becoming someone who can be disappointed. Beginning to need things means becoming someone who can be let down. Beginning to feel things at full volume means losing the steady, managed calm that other people admired and you privately used as proof that you were okay. You're trading a known quantity, a painful one but known, for the radical uncertainty of discovering who you are when you're not bracing for impact. And then there's the strangest cost, the one that catches people most off guard: the loss of the familiar suffering itself. You've lived inside this system so long that you know every wall, every corner, every predictable ache. You know what to expect from yourself in every situation. You know how you'll manage the next demand, contain the next emotion, survive the next stretch. There's a twisted kind of expertise in that knowing, a dark fluency that took years to develop. Giving it up means becoming a beginner at your own life, and nobody warns you how humbling that is, or how the survival system will use that humiliation as one more reason to stay in the den. But here's what Jung found in the people who paid these costs. He studied them for decades, and what he described wasn't happiness. He was careful and consistent about that distinction. The goal he pointed toward was never happiness, because happiness is a weather pattern. It comes and goes, and no psychological framework can make it permanent. What he observed in people who completed this transition was something he kept calling wholeness, and he meant something very specific by it. Wholeness, as Jung used the word, is the capacity to experience the full range of what being alive actually involves. Joy and grief in their actual proportions, without the amplification of a system that treats both as emergencies requiring immediate management. Desire and loss, without the survival persona's reflexive move to flatten everything into something controllable. Presence to the actual texture of your existence, the beauty of it, the difficulty of it, the ordinary weight of an afternoon, rather than the curated, defended, carefully monitored version you've been substituting for experience your entire adult life. The person who arrives at this doesn't have fewer problems. They aren't protected from loss or immune to difficulty. They haven't transcended the human condition or achieved some elevated state where suffering becomes optional. What they have is a different relationship to their own experience. They're no longer spending the majority of their psychological energy keeping themselves from fully feeling what they're going through. The enormous resources that went into running the surveillance system, maintaining the persona, suppressing every inconvenient feeling before it could fully form. All of that energy becomes available for something else. For the first time, it becomes available for living. Jung described it as the difference between a life that is endured and a life that is inhabited. Both can contain the same external circumstances, the same job, the same city, the same relationships. The difference is entirely internal. It's the degree to which the person is actually present for their own life, rather than managing it from behind glass, watching it happen to someone who looks like them but can't quite feel what they're going through. The animal emerges from hibernation, and it doesn't emerge because it made a decision. Something older than decision moved through it, something that remembered what warmth felt like even after months of cold, something that knew in its body what the mind had stopped believing, that winter was a season, not a permanent condition. It comes out blinking, uncertain, muscles remembering motions they haven't made in a long time. The world is larger than the den, more exposed, more vivid in ways that are overwhelming before they become beautiful. It has to relearn things it once knew without thinking, how to move in open space, how to respond to stimuli that aren't threats, how to exist without walls on every side. But it is, in the full and undiminished sense of the word, awake, present in its own life, alive in the way it was built to be alive, in the way the den was always meant to be temporary, in the way every survival system is meant to be outgrown by the organism it was designed to protect. Jung spent his entire career insisting that this is what every person living in survival mode is moving toward, whether they can see it yet or not. The spring is always coming, the thaw is always possible, and the person who emerges from it won't look like the persona you've been performing. They'll look like who you actually are, less polished, maybe, less impressive by the metrics the survival system used to measure everything, but real in a way the persona never was and never could be, present in a way that changes every room you walk into, every conversation you have, every relationship you build from this point forward. Alive in the specific, irreplaceable way that only you can be alive, because only you have lived inside this particular winter, and only you know what it cost, and only you can decide that the cost of staying is finally greater than the cost of stepping out. If you've been in survival mode for years, if the idea of living differently still feels more like a threat than an invitation, what Jung would want you to know is that the system keeping you in the den was never your enemy. It was the most loyal protector you've ever had, and protectors don't stand down because you tell them to. They stand down when they're shown, slowly and with patience, that what they were guarding has grown strong enough to exist without that particular kind of defense. This is slow work. Jung was explicit about that. Individuation isn't a project you complete. It's a direction you orient toward and keep orienting toward. Even small movement matters. A moment of desire acknowledged instead of suppressed. A feeling actually felt instead of immediately contained. A present moment encounter instead of a performance. Those aren't small things. Jung would have called them the beginning of everything. You've already survived the hardest part. The years inside the system, the compression, the self-erasure. You made it through all of that. The question now isn't whether you're strong enough. The survival system already answered that question on your behalf, a long time ago. The question is whether you'll let yourself do more than survive. Whether you'll let the thaw happen, even though it means feeling things you've been successfully not feeling for longer than you can remember. Whether you'll risk the open air after all those years in the den, knowing that open air means weather you can't control and ground you haven't mapped, and a version of yourself you haven't met yet. The spring is real. The person who emerges from it has been waiting, underneath the persona, underneath the vigilance, underneath every layer of protection the system built. for a very long time. And that person, the one the survival system spent all those years keeping safe, didn't endure all of that just to stay in the den forever. If you're somewhere in that threshold right now, recognizing the system for what it is, starting to feel the stirring but not yet trusting where it leads, we put together something called True Self-Discovery. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, built for exactly this part of the process. The part where understanding isn't enough anymore, and you need somewhere specific and personal to begin. The work of living has to start somewhere. This is one place it can. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.